wonderful cycles. And that's the water cycle. And the water cycle consists of two simple parts. One called evaporation, and the second called condensation. When water is experiencing heat, it will go from a liquid form to a vapor form. And when air gets warmer, it will rise. So during warm temperatures or hot temperatures where the air is very warm and hot, water is going to go from the ocean or a lake or a river and is going to move up into the upper atmosphere. Eventually it will get high enough, and the air up in the upper atmosphere will get cold, and it can't hold any water anymore, and it's going to start to squeeze the water that it has out of it, and that's called condensation. When the water vapor, now in gaseous form, is going to go back into a liquid form, in the form of rain, or if it's cold enough, could be snow or sleet. So evaporation and condensation are constantly going on. Air is pulling up water from the oceans and the rivers, and is putting it back down on the earth by a process of condensation. Clouds basically then are formed by water vapor. But how does a cloud form? When the water gets up into the upper atmosphere, it needs something to condense on. And if there are dust particles or particles of soot or anything else that might be up there, the water can sort of get attracted to it and then condense out onto it, condensation nuclei. As more water vapor attaches itself to these nuclei, more and more water becomes denser, clouds begin to form, and eventually there's enough water vapor there to make a formation of a cloud. Heat evaporates the water from the surface. The evaporation in that evaporated water comes up into the atmosphere, and depending upon the amount of water vapor and the condensation nuclei that are there, the larger and larger the cloud will become. As the water droplets increase in size and the cloud becomes eventually so deep it can no longer hold all that water, and it's going to be squeezed out. And because the temperatures of the clouds are much cooler than they are at the surface of the earth, then it's going to start to get rid of that water, and when we have that water we have condensation, and that comes out in the form of precipitation. And the type of cloud is determined both by the temperature and the height at which the cloud is being formed, and these vary from the earth all the way up to 75,000 feet. And the cloud is constantly changing in its shape because the earth is spinning and the westerly wind is pulling those clouds around, and it's because of air circulation that we see the dramatic change that we see in the clouds. Cumulus clouds are the ones that you always see on a nice clear day or a day when it's good weather, and those are nice fluffy marshmallow-like clouds, and they can go pretty high. They can go up as far as 75,000 feet in the air. If you get really cumulus clouds, they get really, really dense, and they're full of water, and they're very, very turbulent, then we can get what we call a thunderhead, and these clouds become very dangerous. These clouds are responsible for storms. They have lightning, thunder, and usually you can see these clouds because they're very, very high, and they may even have a top to them when they get up there, and that's called an anvil head, and that's where the thunderhead is. And they're so dark you usually can't see light through them because they're just blocked by so much water. Now, how do we name a cloud? Well, clouds are basically named by where they are. And we use the prefix cirro, meaning wispy hair like clouds. And these are way up there. They're at 20,000 feet above the surface of the earth. And usually you can see them because they're very thin and they look like little feathers. When something's at a middle altitude, usually between 6,500 feet and 18,000 feet, then what we have is what we call alto something or other. Cumulo is the prefix we use for nice fluffy marshmallow type clouds that you see on a nice pleasant day. Nimbo means rain, And so when we have a nimbocumulus cloud or a nimbostratus cloud, we know that those clouds are probably full of rain, hail, snow, or sleet. And another prefix we use in naming clouds is what we call stratus. Stratus means layered or flat, and we see these clouds often sometimes. Now, clouds are determined by their altitude and their temperature. And low altitude clouds usually form between the ground and 6,500 feet. And here's an example of stratus clouds, which are very uniform and flat. Sometimes they're pretty dark. They have no distinct edges. They're not fluffy like cumulus clouds are. And they're below 6,500 feet. When you ever see these kind of clouds, they're called stratus clouds. They're flat. Stratocumulus clouds, here we have a combination of both. We see the flatness underneath the cloud, but we also see the fluffiness and the marshmallow type kind of cloud at the top. So when we see a flat cloud with a top on it like this is called a stratocumulus cloud. And you see those lots of times when we're just before we get to see a storm coming in. Another low-level cloud is what we call fog. When you wake up and you see fog in the morning, this is where a cloud is actually forming right on the ground. In high places like mountains, you see this all the time. And you see this in the wintertime too, when it's been a warm day and then it cools at nighttime. And then when you wake up in the morning, all that water had to go someplace, so it's forming a fog at the surface of the earth. That's what fog is. Well, what are mid-altitude clouds? Well, these form between 6,500 feet. Here's an example of an alto. Remember what we said alto meant? Middle. And a cumulus clouds. So these are cumulus clouds at a little higher altitude than the ones we saw before. They're puffy, they're scattered, they're patchy. They look like little plots of marshmallow floating in the air there. Here's altostratus clouds. See how thin they are right in here. And again, between see these because they're just like somebody just painted them in there with a paintbrush. Those are called altostratus clouds. Then we have high altitude clouds. And these clouds form anywhere from 18,000 feet up to, in the thunderhead, we can go up to as far as 75,000 feet. And that's about like 12 miles, 15 miles up in the air. So they can be at very, very high vertical composition. Cirrus clouds, again, are very high clouds, but as you can see here, and what they are basically ice crystals. And then many times what you see in here, if you look at these, when the sun comes through them, you see little rainbows, because those are the ice crystals acting like prisms that are causing the light to break up into the colors of the rainbow. Cirrocumulus clouds, these are another type of cumulus cloud, but now they're even higher up in the atmosphere, above 18,000 feet. Again, they're patchy and they look fluffy, but they tend to be much smaller. Then we got cumulonimbus clouds, which are very high clouds, and as we said before, cumulo meaning fluffy and nimbus meaning rain. So when you see these dark clouds that are rising high above the heavens, these are most likely going to be your storm clouds. And they will produce all kinds of precipitation depending on how cold the temperature is and how high the water molecules have to circulate in the height of the cloud. If the water molecule gets thrown around and pushed up and down, it will melt, and then it will freeze, and it will melt, and it will freeze, and this is the kind of precipitation will turn into hail. And that's why, depending on how many times the water molecule has been bounced around up there in that big cloud, will determine the size of the hailstones. And we have seen hailstones as big spaceballs sometimes if we have a real bad storm. Thunderclouds, again, as we said, rise high above the atmosphere. They're very turbulent. They're very nasty looking. And they're very cumulus-like, too, because they have so much water vapor in them. And they rise high into the heavens. And after a storm, sometimes after the storm's over, you look in the clouds and you see this patch of cirrus cumulus clouds. And these, again, are just patchy clouds that just sort of fill over all the space. And again, another type of cloud. So what is a cloud? A cloud is simply water vapor. It's moving around by the circulation of the earth as it's being rotating, and it's caught in the upper winds, up in the jet streams. And then what we see is depending on how much moisture it has, the altitude level it is, the temperature it's at, we will have the formation of clouds that we do. So the next time you look at clouds, you'll know what they are. Try to identify them and see if you can figure out what they are.